Book 3 in the new Thinking Aloud dialogue series is UFOs and UAP, Are We Really Alone? Now available on Amazon.
New Thinking Aloud is presented by the California Institute for Human Science, a fully accredited university offering distant learning graduate degrees that focus on mind, body, and spirit. The topics that we cover here. We are particularly excited to announce new degrees emphasizing parapsychology and the paranormal. Visit their website at cihs.edu. You can now download a free PDF copy of issue number 8 of the New Thinking Aloud magazine or order a beautiful printed copy. Go to newthinkingaloud.org.
Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. Our topic today is psychic unity, the concept of one mind, of cosmic unity, a topic normally associated, of course, with mystical traditions, spiritual culture. We're going to explore, however, the concept of psychic unity today as it appears in academia, in sociology, in anthropology, in conventional psychology. And with me today is Marilyn Schlitz, an anthropologist, a parapsychologist, and research associate at the Mind Science Foundation in San Antonio, Texas. Welcome, Marilyn.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure to have you here. I think a good starting point for looking at the concept of psychic unity might be the writings of the great sociologist Emil Durkheim, who referred to the concept of the group mind in explaining social interactions.
Certainly the concept of a collective consciousness was articulated by Durkheim. He was really interested in the idea of religious experience and how, in fact, one can formulate some idea of God. And his idea, working within the framework of Aborigines culture, was to identify those periods of time when people come together in communal activity, and then to postulate that there is some sort of transcendent experience that these people share as a result of their group interaction. And this he called collective consciousness. He didn't formulate any kind of cross-cultural connection between people. In fact, Durkheim, as is sociology in general, the study of limited groups within a limited area.
Mm-hmm. So Durkheim was in effect suggesting that the various deities, though, of different cultures were in effect projections of a group mind.
That's absolutely right.
Embodiments of a group mind. And as I recall my days of reading Durkheim, he meant the notion of the group mind to be something quite real, not just a theoretical construct.
That's right. I mean, in his ideas, the collective actions and beliefs of the group then take on something that transcends any individual. He isn't formulating any kind of real metaphysical construct, I think, in the form of a mystical belief system.
Not at all.
In fact, right, he's reducing the mystical experience to the group activity and to this sort of collective group consciousness.
Mm-hmm. I think it's interesting to explore these notions because most people who are interested and feel inspired by the mystical writings of the group mind don't realize that there are parallel notions in the conservative bastions of academia.
This is certainly true. I know that in anthropology, folklore, archaeology, a variety of different academic disciplines, you find an attempt to explain the emergence of cultural parallels in areas of the world that lack any kind of physical interaction. For example, in archaeology, one of the issues that is of value is trying to understand how, for example, Mesoamerica and China both developed complex calendars, which in many cases share identical names. under circumstances that preclude any kind of obvious sensory interaction.
Or how about the pyramids that are found all over?
Pyramids also. And so there have been a variety of different kinds of theoretical formulations, if you would,
Yes.
that have been elaborated to try and understand this kind of parallel development.
This has always been a big controversy, I suppose, in these disciplines.
Well, I think that one of the issues that anthropologists have been trying to deal with, folklorists, is to try and account for some kind of physical understanding, explanation that doesn't have to bring us into a metaphysical framework. I think oftentimes they fail in those attempts, and what you find in the scientific literature dealing with this collective consciousness is in a sense a bridge between religion and science.
Well, I guess, for example, with the calendars, with the pyramids, there's often an effort to find some kind of physical linkage. Could there have been commerce or boats or some kind of, and yet the evidence is, if one takes a strictly empirical point of view, there's no evidence to suggest in many cases that there was.
Oh, this is very true, and I think that on an analogy, if not a potential explanation for what's happening, takes us into the realm of parapsychology. It's certainly possible that if telepathy can operate, if one mind can communicate with another mind without any kind of sensory interaction, that we could employ this kind of concept to understand how two separate, spatially isolated cultural groups could develop exactly identical cultural practices, material artifacts, without any sensory interaction.
Freud also, who was certainly a conservative thinker with regard to mystical notions, generally attributed mystical ideas to infantile regression, reverting back to the state of an infant's notion of oneness with the mother. Yet Freud himself couldn't help but point out to the universality of the Oedipal myth and other myths in different cultures.
And this is absolutely true. One of the things about Freud is that I think his more occult undertones have been downplayed by those people who were attempting to promote him as a mainstream psychologist. And also they felt that, for example, his affiliation with Jung was in many ways a distraction or detraction from sort of the scientific integrity of his work. One of the things that Freud postulated in a very Lamarckian kind of influence clearly seen there.
Let me just stop you for a minute, and we should point out that Lamarck is the genetic thinker who believes that genetic characteristics which are acquired can then be passed on genetically. Extremely controversial view, which was at one time, as I recall, the mainstream view in the Soviet Union.
I'm not familiar with that, but certainly Freud, in his book, both The Moses and Monotheism and in Civilization and Its Discontents, talks about an inherited memory in which he believes that there's, for example, the nationalism that people share. He would refer to a national identity, and he didn't feel that this was a culturally transmitted form of national identity. He felt that this was a genetically transferred, and that it was mediated through these memories, or memory traces is what he referred to them as. And one of the examples he gives, he develops, and if you read Freud's writings, you see that it's very myth-like in itself. And his writings have come under a lot of criticisms from more conservative psychologists. But in dealing with the concept of the Oedipal myth, he constructed what he believed to be a true historical basis for the Oedipal myth, namely that there was a point in history when there was a strong father figure who had multiple wives and who basically drove the sons out of the horde so that he could have, exclusive property of his wives. And these sons were jealous and plotted ultimately his demise, killed him, and then regretted this.
The primeval father.
Absolutely. But literally in Freud's construction. I mean, he's not seeing it as simply a metaphor. He's seeing it as having historical basis. And that the sons then killed the father and then repressed, as a result of their guilt over this, they then instated various kinds of rituals to pay homage to the father, and this guilt was then repressed. Freud then argues that this collective memory is stored in all of us, and that explains the cross-cultural occurrence of this Oedipal myth.
And the Oedipal complex, I guess, which,
complex.
according to Freud, is that males grow up wanting to make love with their mothers and kill their fathers.
That's right.
And that the mythology tends to support this in many, many diverse cultures, from African tribes, of course, to the ancient Greeks who wrote the play about Oedipus, who did just that.
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, there are other examples of cultural parallels in addition to the Oedipal myth. Certainly mythology and a variety of different folklore genre you find across cultures. One of the interesting examples, I think, is of Vladimir Prop, who is a Russian folklorist, he's no longer alive, but who did a structural analysis of various folk tales, what he referred to as wonder tales. And he identified structural commonalities across this particular genre within Russia. Well, later scholars, Alan Dundes, who's here at Berkeley, and another person who was studying in Africa, identified the wonder tales of, in the case of Dundes, the Native American Indians, and in the case of the African studies, some folk tales that were common there. And without any kind of conscious intention on the part of the different social groups, they had developed an internal structure that was identical. And so the question then becomes, well, how do we explain this kind of cultural parallel?
The internal structure of the stories themselves.
Absolutely, yes, and the progression of the narrative, the emergence of different actors, and then the resolution of certain conflicts within the folk
Sort of
tales.
from the point of view of like a literary criticism of these stories.
Yes, that's right.
Identical across very, very diverse cultures.
Right, absolutely. And of course, as you mentioned, one of the common explanations for this is that there was some kind of culture contact. In the case of the wonder tale, however, I think it precludes that kind of explanation because they weren't aware of this structural component themselves. And so it was only when an analyst from the outside came in and identified this structural characteristic that we're able to identify this cultural parallel. So I think that gets us away from this idea that somehow the explanation was some kind of sensory contact, culture contact between the groups.
I suppose really the most prominent example of the notion of psychic unity must be Carl Jung's concept of the collective unconscious.
Certainly, yes. Jung's and the idea of the archetype,
Yes.
and that somehow our minds go into some collective realm where we share certain mosaics of symbol, as it were, that we then tap into to express our interpsychic conflicts.
Carl Jung noticed in analyzing the dreams of thousands of his clients that they seemed to embody the same motifs that he found in the writings of the ancient alchemists or in the various myths, as we mentioned, the teaching stories and myths throughout the world. And he felt that these are part of our common heritage, that these myths may even reflect structures in our brain, perhaps.
That's right. And there are different ways of formulating how it is that some kind of psychic unity can occur. And one way certainly is that there's a biological similarity that we all share. And I think that what the various scholars across the different academic disciplines have attempted to do is to formulate a system of constraints that somehow operate upon human consciousness and limit our variability. I think that in early anthropological writings, you find that there was in fact, the very earliest anthropological writings, the development of the unilinear evolution program, one of their interests was in documenting these cultural parallels.
What is the unilinear evolution program?
Basically, the idea that there was only one culture, and that various groups in different places in the world were simply going through or evolving at different stages in this unilinear schema. And one way of proving this kind of construction was to then identify different or similar cultural traits in different places. The unilinear evolution came under a lot of criticism by people like Franz Boas, who said that it was not scientific, that it was basically pulling out artifacts from the cultural repertoire and doing it in a very sort of...
In other words, sort of going back to Adam and Eve, in a way, and we all had the same set of parents ultimately.
Yes, basically, right. And that the racial differences, for example, were due to environment. There are various kinds of environmental determinism. But my point was that the evolutionists came under criticism by people like Franz Boas. And Boas argued that we had to be much more sort of rigorous in terms of making generalizations, and that, in fact, he developed this idea of historical particularism. But even Boas, who was very conservative, couldn't get away from some idea of what he called limited possibilities, i.e. that there are certain constraints that operate upon human consciousness that limit our variability and that cause these occurrences, these cross occurrences of cultural traits.
And this theory of historical particularism, what is that?
Well, basically the idea there is that Boas was interested in a scientific, rigorous research program. And the easiest way for him to construct that was to look at small groups in limited areas. And when we're talking about cultural development and the sharing of cultural traits, basically he was interested in diffusion of ideas from one group to another. And the only way to identify that diffusion was to treat people in a small geographical location. But it was still not possible to explain or account for many of these cultural traits that occur in areas that aren't limited by some geographical boundaries. And
so even within that rigorous model of his, he was still stymied by the evidence.
I think the issue is really implicit in many of the writings that we find about cultural development and about genetic development. I mean, I think it's an implicit issue that permeates sort of Western scientific development.
You can look, for example, in biology and see, for example, mollusks like octopi who have been separated from our ancestors, the vertebrates, for hundreds of millions of years, have developed similar organs. The octopus has an eye very similar to the human eye.
And again, one possible explanation for that is that there is a certain limitation of variability, and that due to environmental influences, factors, that shapes or restricts the range of possibilities.
Well, you know, I find it interesting when we look at the data. It seems as if there's always two groups of scholars. There are those who postulate a commonality, a life force, a group mind, or morphogenetic fields, or some type of a almost mystical or psychic hypothesis. And then you have another group who try to say, let's be empirical, let's be rigorous, let's not jump to theoretical conclusions about this. And they'll be arguing about these things for the next 2 or 3 or 10,000 years if they have a chance. What I find amazing is that the theory of psychic unity, whether one encounters it in philosophy or in anthropology or sociology or biology or in mysticism, it seems to me to have a power that goes beyond the analysis of it, whether or not it's true or false. It inspires people. It awakens something within us. That's why I think the debates about it get so lively.
Oh, I think there's no question about that. I think, people have been attempting to scientize a religious belief. And your point earlier about the sort of dichotomy within the scientific discourse, I think that you find that there's this attempt, this intrigue with anomalies, and that somebody who's going to make a contribution to the scientific framework or enterprise wants to find something that doesn't quite fit, but with the goal of integrating it within the broader framework. And I think that, again, here's an implicit Western idea that we need to make things fit. We need to have the pieces work together. And I'm not sure that that's a fair representation of what some of these more spontaneous occurrences are really doing.
It perhaps might be a more realistic approach when dealing with this kind of evidence to admit that it's ambiguous. That we don't have an answer that, as appealing as the theory of psychic unity is to me, and I implicitly accept it, but I don't accept it necessarily on the grounds that it'll ever be proven scientifically, but on other grounds, on philosophical grounds for myself, or maybe on aesthetic grounds, that it just appeals to me that somehow everything in the universe is ultimately connected. And I don't know if it's at the biological level, or at the mental level, or at the subatomic level, or perhaps at a metaphysical level. I accept that there has to be a unity somewhere implicitly, but needn't force that into academic disciplines.
Yes, but I think that the scientific enterprise is certainly a worthwhile one, and that trying to understand the limitations or lack of limitations on the human potential and human consciousness is an important and worthwhile task to do. I think you're right, though, that in many cases our sort of intrigue and our enamored state with science forces us to try and construct many things that don't quite fit within the scientific framework. We're forcing them through sort of a preconceived theoretical or methodological filter rather than allowing the phenomena of life to sort of exist on their own terms.
Right, and it seems to me that every time a great scholar, a Freud or a Durkheim or a Bergson, comes along in the area of scholarship and talks about the life energy or talks about psychic unity or the elan vital, they arise or stimulate in their colleagues an enormous kind of opposition. I recall one scholar once wrote that if we've learned anything in 20th century philosophy, it's that Bergson was wrong.
Yes, right. He was a very controversial character.
And yet here we are, you in particular in the field of parapsychology, where through your research in psychic healing and in remote viewing, you are documenting in the most rigorous way probably the most uncomfortable kinds of anomalies that we have in science today.
The thing about parapsychology, in keeping with the psychic unity idea, I think is that on the one hand it is anomalies, and it does challenge those more dissident types in the scientific community, those more conservative types. But at a popular level, the idea of psychic phenomena has great street validity. I mean, most people feel that they've experienced some kind of psychic phenomena, and whether or not that's got any objective validity to it or not, it certainly is a comforting thought at sort of this point in Western history that we have lost the dominant structure of religion in shaping our code of life and ethics. And science has really taken a dominant role, scientism, like religion, but that's a very alienating process for many people. And so I think that the concept that there is some connection between people, that we can have telepathy between two people, is really a very sort of nurturing kind of sentiment for people. It makes us feel much more reassured that we're together and not separate.
Sort of that there's another solution to the problem of existential alienation.
Yeah, it really is an existential question, I think, and people are looking for some means of finding a connection. I asked, Rupert Sheldrake's work obviously fits within this whole framework of the collective mind or cultural parallels, and his formulation of the morphogenetic fields.
He's a biologist who suggests that the various developments in biology that have occurred independently of each other, or not just biology, psychology, even chemistry, can be explained by this mechanism, of unifying mechanism he calls the morphogenetic field, which seems to have no explanation yet in physical science. And I guess that's the tricky thing about all of the psychic unity theories is they don't seem to be explainable except through parapsychological mechanisms.
That's right. And Sheldrake's theory has, again, in terms of the street validity, he has achieved or attained a position of great popularity amongst sort of the general populace. And I asked him once why he felt that was so. And his reaction was that people are really hungry for some kind of reconciliation between their metaphysical framework and their need for science.
Yeah. It almost strikes me that when people have psychic experiences and yearn for this connection and an understanding, a mental framework that deals with psychic unity, what they're really trying to break out of is the ideology of science, which denies it, and also the ideology of religion, which imposes it, but often in a very funny, constrained way.
Yeah, I think so. And one of the things about science, too, is the very reductionistic aspect to it, in that we all become very compartmentalized. And going back to your existentialism, it's very alienating to only be alone And it's much more gratifying to think that we might be able to come up to with some solution to sort of the arms race, for example, by connecting ourselves with other people, the Americans with the Russians, at some sort of psychic level. Psychic not in the not necessarily meaning psi or paranormal explanations, but in terms of some shared common psychic substrate that makes us similar.
If we only understood ourselves to be one with all other people on the planet, the only motive that we would have for war would be the motive of self-destructiveness.
Absolutely. That's absolutely true.
And I guess that brings up a whole other range of questions. What do you do? How do you deal with self-destructiveness when you have a model of psychic unity?
Well, that's a very good question. I think, certainly the whole notion of espionage and the military ideas that we can have secrets from each other becomes directly challenged by the notion of psychic unity. And I think that's true. The parapsychology literature has a lot to contribute to our understanding of this kind of debate. And remote viewing work, for example, the idea that one person can describe the physical surroundings of another person or describe the mental thoughts of another person.
And we should mention that you've personally engaged in many experiments of this type yourself.
That's right. And
across continents.
That's right. We've done a number of studies looking at the ability of one person to describe another person's surroundings, and under conditions that were highly rigorous and that precluded any kind of diffusion of information, if you want to go back to the analogy with anthropology. And I think what we find in this kind of experimental knowledge is that we really don't have secrets anymore, and we really are we're still capable of having secrets, and one of the limitations of the psychic process is that we don't have absolute confidence whenever we have a psychic impression.
It's almost as if, as the art of warfare developed, as one looks at the ancient Chinese literature and such, that one of the arts of warfare is to feint, is to deceive your opponent as with regard to your intentions. And somewhere along the line, we've kind of bluffed ourselves into believing that none of us are psychic on the planet. We've kind of convinced ourselves that psychic unity doesn't exist so that we can pursue selfish ends that we couldn't pursue if we all accepted it as being correct.
No, that's a really very provocative idea, and certainly the connection between capitalism and science is a clear commentary on your point there.
Yeah. Well, Marilyn, it's been a pleasure having you with me. We've got just a moment before we end the program, and I'd like to ask you this personally, as an individual who's engaged in this research. How do you feel about the notion of psychic unity? Are you comfortable with that idea yourself?
I think we need to be careful in not reducing psychic unity to some singular causal explanation, and that there are mysteries in the universe is by no means something that we should try and do away with. And the fact that there are cultural parallels doesn't need simply to be reduced to scientific explanations, but it's really nice that we can bridge the religion with the science, and I think psychic unity is a good case study for that.
So while you kind of are intrigued by the idea that all is one, you're not ready to sort of jump into the waters entirely.
I think it's maybe an artifact of our Western framework, and I think we need to be careful that we don't force ourselves into theoretical generalizations that aren't responsible to the phenomena we're studying.
Marilyn Schlitz, thank you very much for being with me.
Thank you, I really enjoyed it.
And thank you for being with us.
Book 3 in the new Thinking Aloud dialogue series is UFOs and UAP, Are We Really Alone? Now available on Amazon.
New Thinking Aloud is presented by the California Institute for Human Science, a fully accredited university offering distant learning graduate degrees that focus on mind, body, and spirit. The topics that we cover here. We are particularly excited to announce new degrees emphasizing parapsychology and the paranormal. Visit their website at cihs.edu. You can now download a free PDF copy of issue number 8 of the New Thinking Aloud magazine or order a beautiful printed copy Go to newthinkingaloud.org